In a town where nothing ever stayed secret, one rumor was enough to turn a pregnant woman into something people feared, and no one dared question it. Elara lived in a quiet mountain town in Colorado, the kind of place where neighbors noticed the smallest changes and stories spread faster than facts. She was 25, recently married to Rowan, and expecting her first child. Their life had been simple, almost predictable, until something about her pregnancy began to draw attention in a way that felt wrong. Her belly grew faster than anyone expected. At just a few months in, it already looked like she was close to giving birth. At first, people only stared a little longer than usual, their curiosity harmless on the surface. But curiosity in a small town never stays harmless for long. It lingers, builds, and eventually turns into something sharper. The whispers started quietly. A glance here, a hushed comment there. No one confronted her directly, but the shift was undeniable. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Doors that used to stay open suddenly closed a little sooner. People who once greeted her warmly now looked away, as if avoiding eye contact could somehow protect them from something they didn't understand. And then there was Shadow. The black dog had always been by her side, loyal and calm, following her every step like a silent guardian. To Elara, he was comfort. To the town, he became something else entirely. The more they noticed how inseparable the two were, the easier it became for imagination to take over. Small details twisted into something darker, something people didn't want to say out loud, but couldn't stop thinking about. The rumor didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, like a stain spreading through fabric, impossible to trace back to a single source. Someone suggested something strange. Someone else repeated it with more certainty. By the time it reached the center of town, it no longer sounded like a question, it sounded like a fact. And once people believed it, they stopped looking for any other explanation. Elara felt the change before she fully understood it. The air around her seemed heavier whenever she stepped outside. The distance between her and everyone else wasn't physical at first, but it became more obvious with each passing day. People didn't just avoid her, they watched her, as if waiting for proof of something they had already decided was true. Rowan noticed it too. He saw the way neighbors exchanged looks, the way conversations bent around them, the way laughter sometimes followed after they walked away. He tried to ignore it, to protect what little normalcy they had left, but even he couldn't deny that something had shifted beyond control. Inside their home, everything still felt the same, but outside, the town had already made up its mind. Elara began to withdraw, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere left where she felt untouched by suspicion. The streets she once walked freely now felt narrow and suffocating. Even the familiar routines, going to the store, passing by neighbors, standing in line, turned into moments filled with tension. And then came the morning when everything became undeniable. She stepped into the town market, expecting nothing more than another uncomfortable silence. Instead, she was met with something colder. The kind of reaction that didn't leave room for doubt anymore. People didn't just whisper, they avoided her completely, as if standing too close might somehow pull them into whatever story they believed she was hiding. That was the moment it truly sank in. This wasn't just gossip anymore. It was fear, judgment, and something far more dangerous, belief without proof. And once a town like that starts believing, it doesn't stop. From that day on, the rumor no longer moved in the shadows. It had taken shape, found a voice, and settled over the town like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Elara could feel it everywhere. She felt it in the silence that followed her footsteps, in the cautious distance people kept, in the cold expressions that replaced the kindness she used to know. What had once been a peaceful life in a small Colorado mountain town was turning into something claustrophobic, as if the entire place had narrowed around her and left her no room to breathe. The worst part was not that people were talking. It was that they had already chosen what to believe. No one cared about truth anymore. The stranger the story became, the more eagerly it spread. Her pregnancy, which should have been a source of joy, had become the center of a grotesque fantasy built out of superstition, boredom, and cruelty. And because Shadow never left her side, the black dog became woven into that fantasy until his loyalty itself was treated like evidence. Elara tried to keep moving through her days as if routine might save her. She cleaned the house, folded baby clothes she had quietly started collecting, watered the plants near the porch, and forced herself to step outside when the walls felt too close. But every simple act now carried tension. If she walked down the road, curtains shifted. If she paused at a gate, people turned away. If she crossed through the center of town, the atmosphere around her changed so suddenly it felt almost physical, as if she were passing through a place where she no longer belonged. Rowan saw the damage building long before Elara admitted how deeply it was cutting into her. He had always been steady, the kind of man who did not waste words or anger on things that did not matter. But this mattered. He could see how she held herself more tightly now, how her eyes no longer lingered on people's faces, how every trip outside left her quieter than before. He knew she was trying to protect him too, trying not to add her fear to the pressure already pressing down on their home, but he could feel it growing anyway. It was in the way she sat awake longer at night. It was in the way she rested one hand over her stomach and stared into nothing. It was in the way Shadow stayed even closer to her, as if he could sense the danger before either of them said it out loud. The town's suspicion spread quickly beyond whispers. It began slipping into daily life in uglier forms. There were no accusations made openly in front of Rowan, not at first. People were too careful for that. Instead, they let their contempt show in smaller ways. A neighbor who once waved now pretended not to see them. Someone who had promised to help Rowan with repairs suddenly became unavailable. A woman who had once offered Elara homemade preserves closed her door before Elara reached the front steps. Each act on its own was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed something impossible to ignore. The town was not simply gossiping. It was isolating her. Then the hostility grew bolder. When Elara went into the market again, she felt the shift before she even reached the produce stand. People did not just go silent this time. They moved. A mother pulled her child aside. An older man turned his back completely. A cluster of women near the checkout looked at her stomach, then at Shadow waiting outside, and their faces tightened with the kind of disgust that made Elara feel stripped bare in the middle of the room. No one needed to say anything. The rejection was complete. She bought what little she could, kept her head down, and walked out with the humiliation burning through her chest like fever. By the time she got home, Rowan knew something had happened. He saw it in her face, in the rigid way she carried the grocery bag, in the tears she refused to let fall. But even then, she did not break. She only became quieter, and somehow that silence hit harder than panic would have. Rowan felt helpless watching it, because there were bruises no one could photograph, wounds no doctor could stitch, injuries made entirely of shame and fear and public cruelty. What made it worse was how fast the story began swallowing him too. Men in town started looking at Rowan with a mixture of pity and ridicule, as if he were either blind or foolish. The mockery was never direct enough to invite a clean confrontation. It came through smirks, muttered remarks, and the smug certainty of people who thought they were standing on the side of common sense. Rowan fought the urge to explode more than once, but he understood something dangerous was happening. If he lost control, even for a moment, the town would use that too. They would twist his anger into proof that he had something to hide. At home, he did everything he could to hold the pieces together. He stayed close to Elara, fixed things around the house that did not need fixing, tried to fill the rooms with ordinary movement so the fear would not settle too heavily. But ordinary life was slipping away. Even meals felt different. Even the evenings on the porch were gone. The house, once a refuge, was becoming a place under quiet siege. Shadow remained the only creature untouched by any of it. He still followed Elara from room to room, lay beside her chair, and rested his head near her feet whenever she sat down. His presence calmed her, but outside that house, it was becoming another reason for people to stare. What had once looked like affection between a woman and her dog now fed a town desperate for something unnatural to believe in. The more faithful he was, the more suspicious they became. And that twisted the knife even deeper, because the one living thing giving Elara comfort had become part of the weapon being used against her. As the days passed, fear began to replace embarrassment. Elara could endure cold looks. She could survive whispers. But she started sensing that something uglier was building beneath the surface. The town no longer seemed satisfied with talking. Rumors that intense never stay passive for long. They demand action. They make people feel righteous. And once people convince themselves they are protecting their families or their town from some imagined evil, they become capable of things they would once have called unthinkable. That feeling proved true one night when a sudden noise shattered the stillness outside their house. Something hard struck the yard, then another. Shadow leaped up instantly, barking toward the darkness. Rowan rushed to the door, his whole body tense, and by the time he got outside, the figures were already disappearing into the night. They had not come close enough to be seen clearly, but they had come close enough to make their message understood. This was no longer just rumor. Someone had decided fear should have a physical shape. Elara stood frozen in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other pressed protectively over her stomach. She did not need to see the stones scattered across the dirt to understand what had just happened. The danger had crossed the boundary of their home. The town that had once surrounded her with familiarity was now pressing in like an enemy. And Rowan knew then that the worst had not happened yet. It was still coming. After the first stones hit the yard, the town no longer felt merely hostile. It felt unstable, as if some hidden line had been crossed and no one intended to step back. Fear changed shape inside Elara after that night. Before, she had been hurt, humiliated, and exhausted by the suspicion hanging over her. Now she understood that the people around her were no longer satisfied with staring from a distance. They wanted to punish what they had already condemned in their minds. The rumor had grown so large that it no longer needed truth to survive. It fed on repetition, on superstition, on the comfort people found in sharing the same cruelty. The next morning, the scattered stones in the yard looked almost harmless in daylight, but that made them even more disturbing. They were ordinary objects, the kind found anywhere, and yet they had arrived carrying intent. Rowan gathered them in silence, one by one, his jaw tight, his movements sharp. Elara watched from the porch with a heaviness inside her chest that she could not shake. The house still stood, the sky still looked the same, the road still cut past their property like it always had, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every familiar thing had become a backdrop for threat. Rowan tried harder after that to keep her from feeling alone. He stayed close whenever he could, checked the doors twice before bed, and started noticing sounds outside that he would once have ignored. But his caution did not make the pressure smaller. It only revealed how serious it had become. Even Shadow had changed. The dog still stayed at Elara's side, but now he remained alert, ears lifting at the slightest noise, body angled toward the door whenever darkness settled over the house. His loyalty, once comforting in a simple way, had taken on the edge of protection. Elara's world kept shrinking. She stopped going out unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then every step beyond the porch felt like stepping into hostile territory. The town was small enough that avoidance became impossible. Faces appeared everywhere. Windows framed watchers. Trucks slowed as they passed. People who had once known her since childhood now looked at her as if she carried something contagious, something beyond explanation and therefore beyond mercy. That was the ugliest part of it all. They were not reacting to anything real. They were reacting to what they wanted to believe, and that made them impossible to reason with. Still, daily life could not be postponed forever. There were groceries to buy, things for the house, medicine, and the ongoing weight of pregnancy itself. One afternoon, after nearly a full day of trying to delay it, Elara went back into town. She moved carefully, her body already heavy from the strain of the pregnancy and the stress pressing down on her from every side. The moment she stepped onto the main street, she felt it again, that silent shift in the atmosphere, that sense of entering a place where every eye was already measuring her. She kept walking anyway, refusing to turn back, refusing to give the town the satisfaction of seeing her run. But the deeper she went into town, the clearer it became that the rumor had evolved into something even more dangerous than ridicule. People were no longer merely avoiding her. They were studying her with hard, deliberate attention, as if waiting for some visible sign of the monstrous story they had built around her. A few teenagers standing near the gas station went quiet as she passed, then turned to watch her. An elderly woman on a bench pulled her handbag closer against her side. Two men near the feed store paused in conversation and followed her with expressions that mixed disgust with fascination. It was no longer disbelief she saw in people. It was conviction. By the time she reached the small grocery near the edge of town, her pulse was pounding hard enough to make her lightheaded. She gathered what she needed quickly, keeping her focus on the shelves, but tension collected around her like static. Every motion felt exposed. Every sound seemed louder. When she stepped back outside, she heard the low murmur of voices nearby and instinctively slowed. A group of young men stood at the end of the block, talking in the careless, dangerous tone of people who believe they are justified. She did not hear every word, but she heard enough. Enough to understand that Shadow had become more than a symbol in their minds. He had become the target. The thought hit her with a jolt so cold it almost stopped her breath. Until then, the rumor had been destroying her life piece by piece, but now it was turning toward the one creature that had never left her side. The men spoke with the simple brutality of those who think violence will solve what fear invented. In their minds, hurting the dog was not cruelty. It was action. It was cleansing. It was the next logical step in a story they had already accepted as truth. Elara did not wait to hear more. She hurried home faster than her body could comfortably manage, her breathing uneven, panic climbing higher with every step. By the time she reached the house, she was trembling. Shadow came running to greet her, tail moving, eyes bright with the same unguarded trust he always carried, and that sight nearly broke her. He had no idea the town had turned him into an omen. He had no idea that outside the boundaries of that yard, people were talking about ending his life as if it were an act of public duty. She knelt and held him tightly, fingers buried in his fur, feeling his warmth, his calm, his innocence. The contrast was unbearable. A creature so loyal, so pure in instinct, had become the center of a madness he could not even perceive. Rowan understood the danger the moment he saw Elara's face. She told him enough for him to grasp the rest, and something in him hardened immediately. Until then, he had still been fighting the situation with patience, hoping the fever of gossip would eventually burn itself out. But now the threat had become concrete. They were no longer dealing with rumor alone. They were dealing with people preparing to act. That night, Rowan stayed outside with a heavy stick across his lap, sitting near the front door long after darkness swallowed the road. He watched every movement beyond the fence, listened to every distant engine, every rustle in the brush, every bark from neighboring properties. The air had a brittle coldness to it, but he did not move. Elara watched from inside with one hand pressed to her stomach, unable to rest, unable to shake the feeling that disaster was crouched just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to rush in. Hours passed, and the silence only made everything worse. Silence in a frightened town did not mean peace. It meant planning. It meant hesitation before action. It meant that somewhere nearby, the same people who had spent days feeding the rumor were now nursing the courage to do something irreversible. The strain began to wear Elara down physically. Stress had been living inside her for weeks, tightening every muscle, stealing sleep, draining color from her face, but now it pressed more heavily than ever. The pregnancy itself was already difficult. Her body felt larger, heavier, more unpredictable with each passing day. Some mornings she woke dizzy. Some afternoons she had to sit down suddenly when a wave of weakness passed through her. Rowan noticed every sign and tried not to show how much it frightened him, but the truth was impossible to hide. Whatever was happening inside her was no longer just the normal burden of pregnancy. Something was wrong, and fear was making it worse. The next day, Elara insisted on going to the creek path near the lower road to wash a few things and clear her head, if only for a short while. Rowan did not like the idea, but the house had started to feel like a sealed box, and she could no longer bear sitting inside it waiting for the next blow. Shadow followed her as always, staying close to her side. The walk itself was slow. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and for a few brief minutes the world seemed almost normal again. But peace never lasted long anymore. She sensed people before she saw them. The feeling arrived first, the same prickling awareness that she was being watched. Then came the distant shapes of a few women farther up the path, pausing in their work, turning toward her with that familiar mix of caution and scorn. Their presence alone was enough to make her stomach tighten. She lowered her eyes and kept moving, determined not to react, determined not to hand them another visible wound to enjoy. But the murmurs followed her anyway, drifting just loudly enough to be heard, carrying the same poison she had been trying to escape for weeks. By the time she reached the water, her hands were shaking. She crouched carefully, trying to focus on the simple repetition of rinsing cloth, wringing it out, setting it aside. But her body felt wrong. Too warm one moment, too cold the next. A dull pressure swelled behind her eyes. The sound of the creek seemed to pull farther away, then rush back too loudly. She braced one hand on the ground and tried to steady her breathing, but the weakness only deepened. The world began to blur around the edges. When she stood, everything tilted. The bucket slipped from her hand and struck the ground. Water splashed across the dirt and stones. For a second she thought she could force herself upright, force herself to walk, force herself to remain in control. But the strength went out of her legs all at once. The path swung wildly. Her vision narrowed. And then she collapsed. The shock of it rippled outward immediately. The women who had been watching from a distance cried out, but none of them rushed in at first. Even in crisis, superstition held them back. Shadow circled Elara frantically, barking in short, sharp bursts, nudging at her arm, then wheeling toward the road as if trying to drag help toward her. Rowan, who had been working close enough to hear the commotion, came running with the kind of speed that only panic gives a man. When he saw Elara crumpled on the ground, something violent and terrified flashed through him at once. He dropped to his knees beside her, calling for help, lifting her carefully, trying to wake her, trying not to let his fear take over. Her face was pale, almost gray beneath the daylight, and her body felt too limp in his arms. The sight of her like that cut through every other concern in an instant. The rumor, the town, the anger, even the danger to Shadow, everything fell away before the blunt, overwhelming fact that something was terribly wrong with his wife. People had gathered by then, but they hovered instead of helping. They stared, exchanged uncertain looks, muttered among themselves, trapped between alarm and the fear their own imaginations had planted in them. Rowan looked at those faces and understood, with a clarity that nearly turned his fear into rage, that they would let a woman die before they risked touching what they had decided was cursed. He did not wait for them any longer. He carried Elara toward the road, got her onto the old truck as fast as he could, and drove for the county hospital with the engine roaring harder than it ever had before. Shadow ran after them until the dust and distance forced him back. The road stretched ahead in a long blur of gravel bends and steep drops, and Rowan gripped the wheel with numb hands while terror pounded through him. Elara drifted in and out of consciousness beside him, barely responsive, her breathing shallow enough to make each second feel like a countdown. For the first time since the rumor began, the story was no longer about shame. It was about survival. And somewhere deep inside that speeding truck, between fear and urgency, Rowan felt another realization begin to rise. Whatever the truth was, they were about to find it, and it was going to change everything. The drive to the county hospital felt endless, even though Rowan had traveled that road his entire life. Every curve through the mountains seemed cruelly longer than before, every stretch of gravel too slow, every second charged with the fear that Elara might slip farther away before he could get her help. Dust rose behind the truck in a long trail, but inside the cab there was only panic, silence, and the sound of Rowan's own breathing turning harsher each mile. He kept glancing at her, watching the unnatural stillness in her face, the weakness in her body, the way her hand rested over her stomach without strength. Until that moment, he had been fighting a town. Now he was fighting time. By the time they reached the hospital, Rowan was no longer thinking about anything beyond getting Elara through the doors. He lifted her out with shaking arms and rushed her inside, his clothes streaked with dust, his mind narrowed to a single point. Nurses took over quickly, rolling her toward the emergency room while he was forced to stop at the threshold. In a matter of seconds, she disappeared behind swinging doors, and Rowan was left alone in the hallway with the kind of helplessness that crushes a man from the inside out. Hospitals had a way of slowing time into something unbearable. Every light seemed too bright, every sound too sharp, every passing footstep too detached from the storm raging inside him. Rowan stood, then sat, then stood again. He ran his hands over his face, paced a short line across the waiting area, stared at doors that did not open fast enough, and listened for anything that might tell him whether Elara and the babies were still safe. But there was nothing. Only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant activity of a place where emergencies happened every day, even if this one felt like the end of the world to him. Inside the examination room, Elara drifted in and out of awareness. Fragments of light, movement, and muffled voices reached her as if through water. Her body felt both heavy and strangely distant, as though fear had numbed her before pain could fully arrive. When she finally began to come back to herself, the first sensation that broke through the haze was pressure in her abdomen, a deep, troubling fullness that no longer felt like ordinary pregnancy. The weakness that had overtaken her at the creek still lingered in waves, and beneath it was something colder. The instinctive knowledge that what was happening inside her body had gone beyond stress, beyond exhaustion, beyond anything she could dismiss. The medical team moved quickly. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen, imaging, questions, more tests. The urgency in their motions told its own story. This was not the kind of pregnancy complication anyone treated casually. Elara's condition demanded answers, and the hospital staff knew it. After initial stabilization, they moved her for an ultrasound, and that was where the tension deepened. The doctor on duty, a seasoned physician named Dr. Harris, studied the screen with the calm face of a man trained not to panic, but Rowan noticed the change in his expression the moment the image resolved more clearly. It was subtle, barely visible, but impossible to miss if you were desperate enough. A furrow at the brow. A longer pause. A silence too careful to be routine. Rowan felt his stomach drop before a single word had been said. Dr. Harris did not rush to explain. He wanted more information first, more certainty, more evidence before putting weight behind any conclusion. That caution only fed the dread building in the room. Elara lay still, eyes fixed upward, breathing shallowly, her fingers curling into the sheet as though gripping fabric might stop her whole body from falling into panic. Rowan stood near her shoulder, looking from her face to the monitor to the doctor's hands, trying to read meaning from details that refused to arrange themselves into anything clear. More imaging followed. More testing. The hospital's atmosphere shifted from routine emergency care to focused concern. Nurses came and went with quiet efficiency, each movement measured, each update partial. Rowan's fear changed shape again, becoming something sharper and more specific. He no longer feared only the rumor destroying their lives. He feared losing Elara altogether. When the first clear explanation finally came, it landed with the force of both relief and terror. Elara was pregnant, but not in the ordinary way the town had imagined. Her rapidly growing abdomen was not caused by anything grotesque or unnatural. It was the result of two realities unfolding at once inside her body. She was carrying twins, and alongside that pregnancy, there was also a uterine mass growing in a way that had accelerated the pressure on her body. The combination had caused the abnormal enlargement, the dizziness, the collapse, and the dangerous strain that now threatened her health. The rumor that had poisoned the town was exposed in an instant for what it had always been: ignorance wrapped in cruelty. But that truth did not bring peace. It opened the door to something far more frightening. Because now there was a real danger, and it lived inside her. The mass did not appear malignant at first glance, but it was serious. It was occupying space, distorting the pregnancy, increasing risk, and creating a situation that could turn critical if left uncontrolled. The twins were there, fragile and alive, but the pregnancy was no longer simple. It had become a medical balancing act, the kind where every decision carried consequences. Nothing about the next few weeks would be easy. Nothing was guaranteed. Elara listened to the explanation in stunned silence, and for a moment it seemed as though the room had grown too small to contain what she was feeling. The rumor had humiliated her, isolated her, and nearly destroyed her life, but this truth struck at something even deeper. She had entered the hospital fighting slander. She was now lying in a hospital bed facing the possibility that her body itself had become a battleground between survival and motherhood. The thought of losing the babies tore at her. The thought of not surviving for them tore at her even more. Rowan felt the floor of certainty vanish beneath him. For weeks he had told himself that if they could just prove the town wrong, everything would begin to heal. But the truth was not simple enough to rescue them cleanly. It came with its own shadow. Yes, the town had been monstrous and wrong. Yes, Elara had been innocent all along. But now the proof of her innocence arrived bound to a much harsher reality: she was genuinely at risk. The hospital admitted her for close monitoring. That first night became the longest either of them had ever endured. Machines tracked her vitals. Nurses checked on her repeatedly. Doctors reviewed scans, charts, and possibilities. Rowan remained by her side as much as the staff allowed, refusing rest, refusing food, refusing the comfort of denial. He watched every flicker of pain cross her face, every fatigue-heavy blink, every unconscious movement of her hand toward her stomach. The fear that had once been directed outward, toward the town, toward the mob mentality closing in around their home, had now turned inward, toward the fragile unknown unfolding inside the woman he loved. Elara barely slept. Whenever she closed her eyes, images rushed in, the townspeople staring at her as if she were cursed, the stones in the yard, shadow pacing the porch, the creak spinning before she collapsed, and now the glowing medical screen that had revealed not one life inside her but two. Beside something that could destroy all three. Joy and dread tangled so tightly together that she could no longer separate them. She had wanted these children. She had already begun loving them in quiet, ordinary ways, through folded baby clothes and private dreams and the simple habit of resting her hand over her growing belly. Now those dreams had been forced into a room with surgical risk, maternal danger, and the possibility of devastating choices. The next round of consultations made the situation even more real. Specialists reviewed the findings and confirmed what Dr. Harris had first seen. The mass was likely benign, but benign did not mean harmless. Its size and placement mattered. Its growth mattered. The pressure it created on the pregnancy mattered. If it continued expanding or triggered further complications, Elara could face severe bleeding, organ stress, premature labor, or worse. The babies, too, were vulnerable. Their development depended on a body already under strain, and every day that passed would need to be weighed against the possibility of sudden deterioration. That was when the conversation neither of them wanted finally entered the room. There might come a point when intervention would be necessary. Surgery could remove the mass, but surgery during a complicated twin pregnancy carried enormous risk. Waiting might preserve the pregnancy longer, but waiting also gave the mass more time to endanger her. Every path forward contained a threat. There was no painless answer, no clean escape, no easy promise that mother and babies would all come through untouched. The hospital could monitor, guide, prepare, and respond, but it could not erase uncertainty. The truth broke something open inside Elara then. Up to that point, she had been enduring fear almost passively, absorbing the hatred of the town, shrinking under it, trying to survive one day at a time. But this was different. This was not rumor pressing on her from the outside. This was a decision looming over her own body, her own life, her own unborn children. She was no longer just a victim of cruelty. She was a woman being pushed toward a choice no mother should have to face. And yet, even under that crushing weight, something changed in her. The shame that the town had forced onto her began to fall away. Not because the pain disappeared, but because reality had become too urgent to leave space for their stupidity. Their gossip suddenly looked small, ugly, and absurd against the scale of what she was truly facing. While they had been whispering about monsters, she had been walking around with a dangerous medical condition, 2 babies inside her, and a body sending distress signals no one bothered to understand. Their ignorance was no longer just offensive. It was obscene. Rowan saw that change in her before she spoke it aloud. Her fear remained, but beneath it a new clarity was taking shape. She no longer looked merely humiliated. She looked wounded and cornered, yes, but also awake in a way she had not been before. The hospital room, with all its harsh light and unbearable uncertainty, had stripped everything down to essentials. There was truth now. There was evidence. There was danger, but it was real danger, not superstition. And once truth enters a story poisoned by lies, it does not stay quiet forever. Still, survival came first. The doctors decided to keep her under observation for longer, watching closely for changes. Rowan stayed. Hour after hour, he remained near the bed, worn down by fear yet held upright by stubborn devotion. He thought about Shadow alone back at the house. He thought about the town still rotting under its own rumor. He thought about the people who had stood by while Elara lay collapsed near the creek. Rage came and went in waves, but it no longer burned as hot as the fear. Fear had won the center of him. Fear that Elara might worsen. Fear that the babies might not make it. Fear that the next set of test results would demand a choice neither of them was ready to make. By morning, the immediate emergency had eased, but the real crisis had only begun. Elara was stable for the moment, not safe. The twins were still there, not secure. The mass was not confirmed malignant, but still dangerous. Nothing had resolved. Everything had sharpened. And for the first time since the rumor began, Rowan and Elara understood that clearing her name would not be enough. The truth was now bigger than reputation, bigger than shame, bigger than the town itself. Because what waited ahead was not just a fight to be believed. It was a fight to keep all 3 lives from falling apart at once. By the time Elara was allowed to leave the hospital, nothing about her life resembled the life she had before the rumor began. She was no longer simply a young woman carrying a difficult pregnancy. She was a woman walking back into a town that had already judged her, now carrying the medical proof that could destroy every lie people had built around her. But the truth did not make the road home feel lighter. If anything, it made every mile heavier. Because now she understood exactly how close she had come to losing everything without anyone around her ever bothering to ask what was really wrong. The mountains outside the truck window looked the same as always, but Elara no longer saw them with the same eyes. The town waiting beyond them no longer felt like home. It felt like a place that had watched her suffer and then fed on the sight of it. Rowan drove with both hands fixed tight on the wheel, his exhaustion buried under a grim kind of focus. Beside him, Elara sat in silence, one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding the folder of test results the hospital had given them. Those papers were thin, almost weightless in her lap, yet they carried more force than anything the town had thrown at her. They held proof. They held explanation. They held the line between ignorance and reality. And still, as she looked down at them, she knew facts alone did not automatically undo cruelty. When they reached the edge of town, the same familiar structures appeared one by one. The gas station, the weather-beaten church, the market, the row of porches facing the road, but everything now seemed stripped of warmth. The rumor had passed through this place like smoke, staining every doorway, every stair, every silence. Elara felt her heartbeat change as they drew closer to home. Not faster exactly, but heavier, as if her body already knew she was returning to the site of an unfinished battle. Shadow heard the truck before it stopped. He burst from the porch and ran toward them with desperate relief, leaping in tight circles, pressing close the moment Elara stepped down. The sight nearly broke her. The dog had no idea how much danger had closed around him while she was gone, no idea how many people had turned his loyalty into something vile. He knew only that she was back and that his place was beside her. Elara knelt carefully despite the ache in her body and buried her hands in his fur. For the first time since leaving the hospital, emotion surged through her so sharply it almost stole her breath. In that moment, with Shadow leaning into her and Rowan standing guard beside them, the truth became even clearer. Everything pure in her life had been twisted by people who preferred fantasy over compassion. The first day home was quiet, but it was not peace. It was the kind of silence that waits. The town had not forgotten. It was listening, watching, recalculating. Word spread quickly that Elara had been taken to the hospital and had come back under medical orders. That alone was enough to pull people toward new speculation. In a place like that, facts did not arrive cleanly. They came tangled with assumption, envy, fear, and pride. By evening, Rowan could already feel eyes on the house from passing vehicles and neighboring yards. The rumor had weakened, but it had not died. Not yet. Elara moved slowly through the house, following the doctor's instructions as best she could. Rest. No strain. No stress if possible. Regular follow-up care. Careful monitoring. The irony of that last instruction bitterly stayed with Rowan. No stress if possible. As though stress were something they could simply lock outside with the rest of the town. But he tried anyway. He made meals, tidied what did not need tidying, kept the curtains partly drawn, and watched Shadow's behavior as carefully as he watched Elara's condition. Every movement in the yard, every engine idling too long, every distant voice made him tense. The danger had changed shape, but it had not vanished. Then it escalated again. A paper appeared in the yard the next morning, crumpled and damp with dew. Rowan found it first. The words were short, ugly, and direct, carrying the stale confidence of anonymous cowardice. Leave town before worse happens. That was all. No name. No proof of who had written it. Only the message itself, enough to confirm what Rowan already knew. The town's fear was beginning to rot into menace. What had started as gossip had become exclusion, then harassment, then threats. People who once would have claimed to stand for decency had allowed themselves to become a mob one step at a time, and now they were deep enough into their own lie that stepping back would force them to confront what they had done. Elara looked at the note without surprise. That was the most unsettling part. She was hurt, but no longer shocked. Something inside her had hardened in the hospital. Not into bitterness exactly, but into clarity. She had spent too many days shrinking herself to survive other people's ignorance. Now she had seen the scan, heard the doctors, felt the danger in her own body, and understood that she had nearly been driven into collapse while the town busied itself inventing monsters. The humiliation that once silenced her was beginning to turn into something sharper. She was no longer only afraid of what people said. She was disgusted by how easily they had chosen to believe it. That same afternoon, the hospital called them back in for another review of the full test results. Rowan drove Elara in without hesitation. The return trip felt different from the emergency rush that had first brought them there. This time there was no blur of panic, no frantic uncertainty about whether she would even make it through the doors. Instead there was a heavy expectation, the feeling that something decisive was waiting at the other end. The consultation room was small, almost too small for the weight of what unfolded inside it. Dr. Harris had the complete findings in front of him now. The uterine mass appeared benign, but its presence remained dangerous. The twin pregnancy was confirmed beyond doubt. The abnormal enlargement of Elara's abdomen had a clear medical cause. There was no ambiguity left, no space for rumor to hide in. What had happened to her was real, explainable, and documented. The town's version of the story was not merely foolish. It was medically absurd. But what mattered most was that the babies still had a chance, and so did she, if everything was handled carefully from that point forward. The doctor laid out the situation with the kind of calm that only deepened its seriousness. Elara's condition would require close monitoring. The mass might remain stable or it might create complications later. Surgery was not immediately necessary, but neither was it off the table forever. The pregnancy had become a narrow bridge. She could cross it, but only if she was protected from strain, from shock, from anything that might tip the balance. Rest was no longer a suggestion. It was part of survival. Elara listened with both relief and dread rising together inside her. Relief because the babies were alive, because the worst diagnosis had not come, because there was finally an explanation strong enough to cut through the madness back home. Dread because the road ahead remained unstable, because nothing was fully safe yet, because even now her body was carrying both promise and threat at once. She was not walking out with a miracle. She was walking out with a chance. And that chance changed something fundamental. On the drive back, neither she nor Rowan said much. They did not need to. The test results resting between them on the seat felt like the center of a silent agreement. For weeks they had been defending themselves emotionally, trying to survive one day at a time inside a lie. Now they had something solid. Something undeniable. It would not heal the damage already done, but it gave them a weapon they had never had before, truth in a form the town could not easily distort. By the time they returned home, a small group of people had already gathered not far from the fence line. Some stood with arms folded. Some pretended not to stare. Some looked embarrassed by their own presence, yet none of them left. Curiosity had pulled them there. Suspicion had kept them standing. The town had sensed movement in the story and come to witness what it thought might be another scandal. Elara saw them and stopped. Only days earlier, she might have turned away, hurried inside, let Rowan deal with it, let silence protect what little strength she had left. But the hospital had changed the meaning of silence. Silence was what had allowed the rumor to grow. Silence was what had let strangers decide what lived inside her body. Silence was what had nearly buried her under shame while a real medical danger went untreated. If she stayed quiet now, the lie would continue breathing in the gaps. So for the first time since the nightmare began, Elara did not lower her eyes. She stood in the yard with the mountain air pressing cold against her skin, her body still fragile, her face pale from exhaustion, shadow planted near her leg, Rowan beside her like a wall, and she faced the people who had spent weeks turning her life into a spectacle. There was no dramatic outburst, no collapse, no pleading desperation. What filled that moment was something stronger: control. The kind that comes after pain has burned away fear. Rowan took out the medical documents and held them where everyone could see. Not as a performance, but as an answer. Test results. Konfirmations. Ultrasound findings. Medical explanations. Enough for anyone with eyes to understand that Elara had been telling the truth simply by existing while the town invented lies around her. A few people stepped closer, their earlier certainty already beginning to crack. Some looked down almost immediately. Others scanned the pages with the stiff discomfort of those who know, even before reading, that they are about to be proven shamefully wrong. The change in the crowd did not happen loudly. It happened in stages. First came silence. Then uncertainty. Then the slow, unbearable recognition moving from face to face that the woman they had treated like a curse had been carrying twins while also suffering through a dangerous medical condition. That her enlarged abdomen had not been some sign of the unnatural, but the visible burden of a high-risk pregnancy complicated by a uterine mass. That while they had been feeding each other filth disguised as belief, she had been getting weaker, sicker, and closer to catastrophe. A few people could not meet her eyes. A few looked angry, not at Elara, but at the humiliation of being exposed. Others seemed stunned by how quickly their certainty had collapsed. That was the ugly truth about mob thinking. It feels powerful right up until reality arrives, and then it turns flimsy all at once. The rumor had sounded convincing only because no one had demanded evidence. Now evidence stood in the yard with nowhere to hide. Elara watched them take it in, and beneath the exhaustion something fierce steadied inside her. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something harder and sadder than either of those. She could see, with painful clarity, how easy it had been for them to reduce her to a story. How eager they had been to believe the worst because it entertained them, frightened them, or made them feel morally superior. None of them had visited to ask if she was ill. None of them had tried to understand why her body had changed so quickly. They had chosen fantasy because fantasy demanded nothing of them except judgment. Now the truth demanded something else. It demanded shame. The crowd thinned slowly after that, not in chaos, but in discomfort. People left in small clusters, faces tight, movements awkward, the energy of certainty draining from them step by step. No one wanted to be the last one standing there under the weight of what they had done. The yard that had once felt surrounded by hostility now held something stranger, the first signs of collapse in the town's false story. But Elara knew it was not over. Exposure is not the same as repentance. People can be proven wrong and still resist changing inside. They can retreat into silence, revise what they said, pretend they were less cruel than they were. A single revelation does not erase weeks of damage. It does not pull back stones from a yard or remove fear from a woman's body or restore peace to a home that has been treated like a disease site. Truth had reached the town at last, but whether the town would truly bow before it remained uncertain. That night, however, the atmosphere changed. For the first time in weeks, the darkness outside the house felt less like an ambush waiting to happen and more like a pause. No engines lingered. No footsteps circled the yard. No stones came flying from beyond the fence. Shadow relaxed enough to sleep with his head on his paws near Ilara's chair, though he still twitched awake at small noises. Rowan sat nearby, watching both of them, the documents still on the table within reach, as though proof itself had become part of the household defense. Ilara rested but did not fully sleep. Her body was tired enough to sink, yet her mind remained sharply awake. She kept seeing the faces in the yard, the suspicion, the cracking disbelief, the dawning guilt. She had wanted the truth to free her, and in some ways it had. But freedom after that kind of cruelty does not feel light. It feels raw. It feels like standing after being dragged through gravel. It feels like realizing you survived something ugly, but not cleanly. Still, one thing was certain now. The town could no longer claim ignorance. And once people have seen the truth with their own eyes, the next thing that comes is judgment of a different kind. Not of the innocent woman they slandered, but of themselves. By morning, that judgment would begin to arrive at her door. Morning came without violence. That alone felt unnatural. For weeks, every sunrise had seemed to carry a new layer of humiliation, suspicion, or danger, as if the town had made Ilara's suffering part of its routine. But on that morning, the air outside the house felt different. The silence was no longer sharpened by hostility. It had changed into something heavier, slower, and far more uncomfortable for the people who had helped create this nightmare. Truth had moved through the town overnight, not like gossip, but like a mirror no one wanted to look into and could no longer avoid. Ilara felt the difference before she even stepped onto the porch. Rowan had already been awake, watching the yard, listening for trouble the way he had every morning since the first stone hit their property. But no one had come in the dark. No engines had idled on the road. No shadows had gathered near the fence. The house, for the first time in what felt like forever, had not been treated like a place under siege. That did not mean peace had arrived. It meant reckoning had. The first visitor came early, hesitant enough to stop at the gate before stepping farther. Then another came. Then two more. Not together, not with confidence, and not with the cold curiosity that had fueled the rumor. They came with lowered faces, with uneasy hands, with the visible strain of people forced to stand in front of the damage they had helped cause. Word had spread quickly once the medical papers were seen. The truth had cut through the town's fantasy with brutal efficiency. Ilara had been carrying twins. The unnatural growth of her abdomen had come from a dangerous but explainable medical condition. The dog had never been anything except what he had always been. A loyal animal standing beside the one person who needed loyalty most. The ugliness of the lie was now impossible to hide. Ilara did not rush to meet those visitors. She remained seated at first, one hand over her stomach, her body still weak from everything it had endured. She watched from the window as the people gathered, not in a crowd this time, but in fragments, as if even their shame kept them from standing too close to one another. Rowan stayed near the door, his posture rigid, not because he feared another attack, but because trust did not return simply because guilt had appeared. Shadow lay near Ilara's feet, lifting his head whenever someone approached, alert but calm, no longer the symbol of suspicion, just a dog in his rightful place. By the time Ilara stepped outside, the mood in the yard had changed completely from the confrontation the day before. Gone were the narrowed eyes, the certainty, the smug conviction that had once surrounded her. In their place was discomfort so raw that some people could barely hold themselves upright under it. They had come to apologize, but apology looked small standing beside what they had done. And what they had done was enormous. They had not simply repeated a rumor. They had stripped a woman of dignity during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life. They had turned her body into a spectacle. They had let fear and superstition outrank compassion. They had made Rowan defend his wife against mockery, threats, and isolation. They had looked at Shadow and imagined evil where there had only been faithfulness. Worst of all, while Elara was actually carrying a high-risk pregnancy complicated by a uterine mass, they had spent their time constructing fantasy instead of recognizing distress. Their ignorance had not been harmless. It had surrounded real suffering and made it worse. Elara stood before them and saw all of that reflected back in the faces of the people who had once looked at her with disgust. Some had brought food. Some held flowers. Some carried awkward offerings that felt less like gifts and more like proof of their desperation to patch what could not easily be repaired. But Elara understood something that none of them yet fully grasped. What had happened could not be undone by politeness. A wound to reputation could sometimes heal. A wound to safety, to trust, to the ability to walk through one's own town without fear, that cut much deeper. Still, she did not meet their shame with cruelty. That was what separated her from them. She listened. She let them stand in the discomfort. She let the silence around their regret do its work. The stronger part of her now was no longer the frightened woman shrinking beneath whispers. That version of her had almost been destroyed. In her place stood someone changed by pain, sharpened by truth, and steadied by survival. She had learned too much in too little time to waste herself on vengeance. Her focus had shifted. What mattered now was her body, her pregnancy, her babies, and the fragile future waiting ahead if she could cross the rest of it safely. So she accepted the apologies in the only way that made sense, without forgetting. That became the true turning point. From then on, the town's behavior changed not because its people had suddenly become wise, but because they had been forced to confront the consequences of what ignorance can do when it is shared often enough. The same streets that had once tightened around Elara now slowly opened back up. The market no longer fell silent when she entered. People who had once stepped away now moved aside for a different reason. To help her pass, to offer a seat, to carry something, to show, clumsily and too late, that they understood how wrong they had been. The church women who had once repeated the cruelest suspicions began sending meals. Families who had pulled their children away now nodded with embarrassed gentleness when Elara walked by. Even the men who had laughed with Rowan's humiliation on their faces stopped looking him in the eye, because they knew exactly what kind of men they had revealed themselves to be. None of it restored the past. But it changed the future. The weeks that followed were defined by caution. Elara's pregnancy remained delicate, and the hospital visits continued. Rowan drove her to every appointment, never once leaving anything to chance. Each scan, each checkup, each measured step forward carried tension. The twins kept growing. The uterine mass remained under observation. Some days were easier. Some days brought new fear. The threat had not vanished simply because the town had discovered its conscience. Elara still lived inside an uncertain body, and every hopeful sign came paired with the knowledge that one bad turn could change everything again. But now she was no longer carrying that fear alone. Rowan never stepped back. If anything, the ordeal had made him even more fiercely devoted. During the worst of the rumor, his love had been the wall that kept Elara from collapsing inward completely. During the medical crisis, it became the force that held structure around her while everything else threatened to give way. He learned how to watch for signs of weakness in her without making her feel watched. He learned when to speak, when to stay silent, when to steady her, and when to simply remain close enough that she could feel she was not facing anything by herself. The town had tried to humiliate him too, to make him doubt, to make him part of its cruelty. Instead it had only exposed how deeply rooted his trust in Elara truly was. That trust carried them through the final stretch. As the months passed, the town's attitude toward Shadow changed in its own quiet way. At first people looked at him with embarrassment, as if ashamed to even let their eyes rest on him after what they had implied. Then children began approaching him again, timidly at first, then with the natural ease that adults had temporarily poisoned. Shadow accepted it all without judgment, the way animals often do. He had never understood the rumor, never understood the threat, never understood the moral collapse of an entire town. He had only known that Elara was his person and that staying beside her was the only duty that mattered. In the end, his innocence became its own kind of indictment against the people who had projected monstrosity onto him. Winter began loosening its grip by the time the pregnancy reached its final stage. The mountains around the town looked less severe, the roads less harsh, the air touched with the first signs of seasonal change. Elara, too, seemed to move into a different emotional season. She was still careful, still often tired, still carrying the physical burden of a complicated pregnancy, but the fear that had once ruled her no longer dominated every moment. It had been replaced by alertness, by resilience, by a quiet kind of hope she had fought hard to reclaim. Then came the night everything shifted for the last time. Labor started with a pain sharp enough to cut through sleep and certainty at once. Rowan was ready before Elara even fully understood what was happening. The hospital bag had been packed for weeks. The truck was fueled. Every necessary paper was already in place. Fear returned, of course, because fear had never fully left them. But this time it moved alongside preparation, not helplessness. They had been living on the edge of crisis for so long that when the final moment arrived, they met it with the hard-earned discipline of people who had already survived too much to break easily. The drive to the hospital was tense, but not frantic like before. The road that had once carried them into emergency now carried them toward decision. The staff moved quickly when they arrived. Elara was admitted. Rowan stayed close. The hours that followed were long, painful, and full of uncertainty, because nothing about this pregnancy had ever granted them the luxury of simple confidence. The doctors monitored not only labor, but the ongoing risk posed by the uterine mass. Every step forward had to be measured carefully. But sometimes survival comes not all at once, but in increments that build toward miracle. The first child arrived healthy. Then the second. 2 boys, alive, breathing, real. The room changed in that instant. Not just in sound, not just in emotion, but in meaning. For months Elara's body had been treated as a site of scandal, suspicion, danger, and fragility. Now it was the place from which life emerged despite everything thrown against it. The twins had survived the rumor, the isolation, the medical fear, the uncertainty, the threat of intervention, and the constant pressure surrounding their mother. Elara had survived too. The uterine mass, though still requiring follow-up care, had not taken her from them. The bridge had held. Rowan looked at his sons and at Elara with the expression of a man who had prepared himself for loss too many times and suddenly found himself standing in the middle of grace instead. The weight in him did not disappear, but it broke open into relief so deep it almost looked like collapse. He had spent months holding the line against a town, against fear, against medicine's uncertainty, against his own helplessness. Now, at last, something good had arrived without a shadow attached to it. When Elara held the babies, the long arc of everything she had endured seemed to gather into one unbearable, beautiful truth. She had been dragged through suspicion, shame, danger, and pain, and yet she was still here, and so were they. News of the birth reached the town quickly. This time the story spread differently. No whispers. No twisted speculation. No hunger for scandal. What moved from house to house now was the plain, humbling fact that Elara had delivered 2 healthy boys after surviving a pregnancy the town had cruelly misunderstood from the beginning. The people who heard it could no longer pretend the past had not happened. The birth did not erase their guilt. It placed it beside new life and made it even clearer how grotesque their behavior had been. That realization stayed with them. When Elara eventually returned home with the babies, the town did not greet her with spectacle. It greeted her with restraint, respect, and something close to reverence. People helped without crowding. They offered support without intruding. They softened their voices around her. They treated her not as an object of fascination, but as someone who had earned the right to be left in peace. It was not hero worship. It was something simpler and more honest. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that dignity belongs to a person before a community decides whether to grant it. Ilara's life did not become magically perfect after that. Recovery was real. Fatigue was real. Follow-up treatment was real. The emotional scars remained. There were still moments when a certain glance, a certain stretch of road, or a certain hushed silence could pull her back into the memory of those terrible weeks. Trauma does not vanish just because the ending improves. But the center of her life had changed. The house that once felt under siege now held 2 infants, a vigilant father, and a loyal black dog still sleeping near the door. The sound inside it was no longer rumor. It was life. And over time, that life became stronger than the story that had tried to destroy it. The town remembered what happened, not because anyone forced a lesson on it, but because some lessons mark a place permanently. People became slower to believe the wildest version of events. Slower to join whispers. Slower to treat difference as threat. Not perfect, not transformed into saints, but changed enough to know how much damage certainty can do when it grows out of ignorance. Ilara herself became part of that memory. Not as the woman they once slandered, but as the woman who endured slander, faced truth, survived danger, and refused to let cruelty define the end of her story. In the quiet hours of evening, when the babies finally slept and the house settled into stillness, Ilara sometimes sat on the porch again. Shadow would lie at her feet. Rowan would be nearby. The mountains would darken slowly beyond the road, and for the first time in a long while, the silence would feel clean. Not empty. Not threatening. Earned. That was how the story truly ended. Not with the town being punished. Not with grand revenge. Not with perfect forgetting. It ended with truth surviving long enough to be seen, with love holding steady when everything else rotted, with innocence outlasting accusation, and with a woman who had every reason to break choosing instead to live forward. And in the end, that was stronger than any rumor ever could be.